This is Americans Abroadcast, the one-stop shop for Americans living abroad. We're going to be interviewing today Diane Sklar, who has a wealth of experience with the healthcare system in France and can help compare the experiences an American might have already had living in the U.S. with what they could expect when they move abroad, where socialized healthcare is the norm. Hello, Diane. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm great. How are you, Matt?
I'm great. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to talk with Ashley and I. We're really interested to hear what your experience has been with the French healthcare system and how that compares to the American healthcare system, and what your experiences were in the U.S. prior to coming abroad.
Start off by asking you, where you live and what was your motivation then to move to France in the first place?
So I live in Lyon, France, even though when I tell people I live in France, everybody assumes I live in Paris. Paris is sort of identified with all of France, but Lyon is probably the third largest city in France after Paris and Marseille. And I chose Lyon because my brother had been living here for about 30 years. He came originally as an expat for a German bank that he was working for. Then he met his wife and stayed. And so that's why I chose Lyon, although I always knew I wanted to live somewhere in France.
Well, that's very similar that you say that because I had a similar experience saying I just always dreamed about living in France as well. So we've got that connection. So how long have you been living there?
I've been here for 9 years, and I came as a mature American. I was already 60 years old when I came, and I'm going to be turning 70 soon. So, yeah, I've had a very interesting experience with the healthcare system and kind of had to learn it very quickly.
So when you moved over to Lyon, did you move alone or did you have any other family members that you came here with?
I came with my husband. So after my daughter finished going to university and we were finished with that major cost, we decided we weren't dead yet, so we wanted to find another adventure. So we went first to London, and I had an expat package with the company I was working for. It was a software company, and they brought me to London, and I worked there for a while, and that job ended. Decided I didn't want to slow down, and I wanted to give myself the opportunity of changing careers. So I decided to come over and join my brother in Lyon. He's my only other family member. My parents are both gone, and my daughter had decided to stay in in New Orleans, where she went to university. So my husband and I came over. I was planning to be a translator. My brother is a translator, and I thought perhaps we could work together. So I started a diploma program at the University of Lyon in translation. And to bring this loop back to the healthcare system, a month after we arrived, my husband had a stroke.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so that came as a big surprise. And we had to sort of change everything. And most people who come to France, or I don't know if this is true where you guys are in Austria, but you come to France with 3 months of private insurance, and then you can be put into the system, the European system. And that was the case here in France, but we didn't have the luxury of waiting because my husband was in the hospital. He needed surgery on his carotid artery. He had to stay in the hospital for like 3 weeks. And mentally, I'm calculating how much this would cost in America. So I knew there was a real urgency to get him into the healthcare system.
So for our listeners, if someone transferring, well, for example, my mother transferring into the medical insurance here needs to pay into the system for 6 months before she can actually use the medical insurance here in Austria.
Okay.
But that's for someone that's over 70. It might be different for someone that is much younger.
Yeah, what I would emphasize for people who are coming here is don't panic. The rules are much less stringent here to get into the system. It's 3 months in France if you're working, and 6 months in Austria if you're retired. So it's all very doable. It's very
And
doable, and you have to get short term private insurance. There's a whole cottage industry
sure.
of American insurance companies who cover you while you're in Europe for that gap period, and then you're in the system. And
And
then
did you have any experience with the National Health Service in the UK prior to moving to France?
absolutely, yes. And well, I was working there, so I just like slipped right in. And the UK, of course, is no longer part of Europe, but it still has socialized medicine. And I'll tell you what, the first time I went there, I just couldn't believe that they didn't want to even see my national insurance card to show that I was a member. There's the thing about England is that no money passes hands, and that was kind of the mantra when they set up the NHS, that no money should pass hands. So you don't. There's no cash. There's no credit cards taken out. Nothing in the UK. Here in France, there is a very minimal payment. I went to the doctor yesterday, for example, and I paid 26 euros. So
Wow. Okay.
yeah, that's under $30, I think, maybe around
And
$30.
what is your general experience when you go to I'm assuming it was a general practitioner, and then it was a regular doctor visit, not some sort of emergency visit.
Yeah, that's right. It was a regular doctor visit. One thing for sure is that in America, you think twice before you go to the doctor. Am I really sick? Maybe this will pass? The pain isn't so bad. But here you go because it is so little in terms of it's very little in terms of the processing of the payment, and very little amount as well. So I find that I'm more proactive about my health here. And yes, I went yesterday. I discovered that I had carpal tunnel syndrome, which makes perfect sense since I've been working in software all my life. And the only question I had is why didn't it happen earlier? And I guess that one thing that I've noticed is that, excuse me, um, a lot of Americans are afraid that if they leave America, the quality of healthcare is going to decline. Like, in America, we have the tip of the knife blade of the most important relevant research. And I don't think that's true. From what I know, dealing with my husband's stroke and his vascular disease and several surgeries that he's had and diabetes, um, medical knowledge is shared throughout the world. And there are sort of general protocols that everybody in the developed world uses. So I have found that the way my husband's being treated for his multiple diseases is very, very similar to the way that he would be treated in the US. And in fact, we spent 3 months in the US last year. So I had like a one-to-one correspondence. And the recommendations and the tests that were run were almost identical. But of course, the costs were a fraction of what it was in the US. And I'm still paying bills. I'm still getting surprise uh, bills from doctors I've never heard of in the U.S. as it goes in the U.S. I don't know if you, Matt, or Ashley have had any procedures recently in the U.S., but it's like the gift that keeps on giving. For weeks and months and years, you still hear about
And,
that one test that you took long
and
ago in the U.S.
in addition to just the medical treatment, do you notice a significant qualitative difference between how the doctor interacts with you, his bedside manner? Do you feel rushed to go through the doctor visit? Does he focus and treat your concerns and address your concerns? Is it in English or in French? Um, what is that experience like?
So I think there is a cultural component that's different here in France versus the US. And I was struck by that when I went back. So yes, Americans tend to just generally be more personal. The doctor might ask you where you were on vacation and how's whatever you last talked about, and they do tend to order tests more. They do tests more. And in fact, my husband now has dementia, and there is no cure for dementia. So everybody on both sides as of the Atlantic is really out of solutions for him. But still, they ordered tests just to verify what they know already and to give me peace of mind, I think.
This was
But
in
in
New
the end,
Orleans.
hmm?
This was in New Orleans, the
It was
additional
in New
testing.
Orleans, yeah, at Ochsner, which is one of the best healthcare systems in New Orleans. So yeah, the people are, everybody in America just has more of a customer service orientation.
Okay.
So I've had a spectrum of doctors here. I adore my GP. She's great. She answers all questions. She knows about my husband. She asks about him. She gives me advice on what to do to get him through the medical system as well. For example, we spoke quite a bit yesterday about whether he needed a COVID update shot or not. So she's very personable and, definitely does the whole gestalt of the patient, and she knows my situation. There are other doctors who there's a lot of bureaucracy here in France, so there's a lot of forms. I would say probably if you take financial forms as well as medical forms, you probably have an equal between the U.S. and here and France. But in the U.S., it's much more financial, and there's more hands in the pot. So you've got Medicare, and you've got Medicaid, and you've got a private insurer, and you have Medicare supplementary insurance. So there's so many levels, and there's so much billing that goes on between all those agencies and private companies that um, I think you have the same administrative charge. But there are doctors here in France who just tend to look at their computer terminal, and as you're answering their questions, they're just filling out forms. They're sort of, I call them the doctors who are treating the computer rather than treating the patient. But I just avoid those doctors, and I go and find others who look me in the eye. And, there's a lot of people when you come here. We're lucky as Americans because our first language is English, and anybody under 50 here wants to learn and practice their English. They've already learned English and they want to practice it. So with my husband's cardiologist, for example,
Mm-hmm.
we talk about current events, we talk about medical situations in America, we talk about literature. So yeah, he's very personable.
I have a question going back to when you said that you first arrived in France and then you had to have private insurance for the first 90 days. So did you have to find a private French company?
No, we found a private. I believe they were American, if I recall correctly. But as with American insurance companies, they are very picky. So they did not want to cover his situation with his stroke and his need for surgery. And so that was it was not an option for us. And that often happens, I think, when you if you don't read the small print. And we wanted to get over here fast. We got this policy. It was a good price, and we found out too late that it wasn't going to cover us. So I had to get into the French system. And what happened was my sister-in-law, my brother's wife, um, hooked me up with somebody who had a lot of immigrants in her family, and she was familiar with taking people through the system. And I wouldn't say that she did anything outrageous or anything miraculous. She just taught me how to do it. And it's kind of a mindset. I came in with the belief that there's no way in hell this is going to work. They'll never let me into the system. I'm going to have to pay cash for this huge medical outlay. But actually, what I've learned in the 9 years I'm here in France is that there's always a loophole. There's always a way to get in the system. You just have to be patient and careful and fill out all the forms they ask for and be polite and respectful. And it happened. So they went on. The other thing in France that's interesting is that, unlike America, where you have to have an advocate, a lawyer, a medical specialist to tell you what the laws are, everything in the law here is published on websites. So you can figure out what the requirements are for getting into the social security system. That's what they call the medical system here, by yourself. Of course, you have to read French, but these days with all the technology, it's pretty easy to cut and paste whole paragraphs of information into a box and get the translation very easily. So
Can
I
I
was
ask
able
what
to.
your French level is? Your general French language level?
Sure. I studied it all my life, but I never lived here. So, for anybody who's studied a language but not lived in the country, you know that there's a big gap. So, I would say after about 2 or 3 years, I started to feel comfortable. I started to feel comfortable, but because I worked in an international kind of environment, I didn't even use French in my working life
Yeah.
here. So even now, I don't feel like I'm as far along as I should be.
So one thing I've noticed is my German was pretty good until I had to go to the doctor. And then it's a whole new set of vocabulary and expressions that you just don't get in a normal classroom environment. It's a specialized vocabulary.
Right.
So did you encounter in French as well that there was a steep learning curve once you started to have to deal with forms and phrases that were new to you?
Um, no, not really. Of course, I'm just dealing with one corner of the medical community. I don't have to know. I'm not a translator, a medical translator, which is a profession here. I don't need to know all conditions, and anything possible could walk in the door. I know the vocabulary of dementia. I know the vocabulary of la maladie vasculaire, vascular
Hmm.
disease. So yeah, when I go to the doctor, I often will arm myself with the questions in French that I want to ask, but I feel comfortable talking to them.
But the key is just to prepare yourself and know that you can communicate what you want to say, because that's the most important, right? When you go to the doctor, that you can communicate what you need. But that's a good tip as well.
Yeah. But if I can just get
So,
back to what happened after my husband had the stroke and we weren't in the system and he had his first surgery. Um, he got out of the hospital after 2.5 or 3 weeks, and the day of reckoning came. They said, before you leave, you need to visit the financial office. So it was like, oh no, here we go. We weren't in the system yet. We were going to have to pay this one. And I had already decided to take money out of our IRA, or our brokerage accounts, to pay for this. I was estimating hundreds of thousands of dollars. The amount that we owed was $11,000. That's for all fees, surgeon's fees, anesthetic, 2.5 to 3 weeks stay in the hospital, nursing, everything. So even if you find yourself um, up against the wall like we did, you can't be financially ruined like you could be in the US.
so you guys
So
ended up
I'm a
paying this.
satisfied customer.
Yeah, I could see that being hugely motivating for Americans who maybe are nervous because of their health condition about moving abroad. Um, if you have mobility issues and you think about moving abroad, do you think about moving? Like actually physically, I'm going to have to move and walk and be able to be ambulatory in this strange city.
Right.
Um,
Well, to give you an idea of some of the fringe benefits that we get here, my husband has a medical bed that's rented from a medical equipment outlet, and that's completely paid for by the government. He has a wheelchair that is also completely paid for. He has all of his medications for his diabetes, his high blood pressure, his statins, all paid for. He's even his not oncologist, endocrinologist for his diabetes. She put him on Ozempic, the new miracle drug, and he lost 40 pounds. And we don't have to pay for that either. And I understand it's like $300-400 in America.
yeah. And do you think that there are medical benefits to simply not being in New Orleans and being in Lyon? I don't know anything about the public transport in Lyon. Um,
Oh, the public transportation is wonderful. Ashley used to live here, so she can tell you. Trams, trains, metro, buses. It's wonderful. So I can take my husband on in his wheelchair, up and down elevators. It's very easy to navigate here.
so even with these medical issues, he still has the the ability to go about and live his life and
Absolutely.
get where he
Yeah.
needs to go. When you lived in New Orleans, did you take streetcars in New Orleans and use public transport in New Orleans, or not
Oh,
so
I
much?
never dared try to get my husband in the streetcar. It's a big step up.
Yeah,
I
it's
don't
very old
remember.
fashioned.
Yeah, it's very old fashioned. I mean, quaint and fun, but not when you're in a wheelchair.
Yeah, and they haven't modernized those. I think
No, deliberately they haven't. It's
it's
a
been 24 years since I was in New Orleans last.
mm,
And incidentally, that was where I left the country. The first time I left the country, I flew out of New Orleans,
mm.
um, and I had wonderful memories of New Orleans.
Oh, it's a great city. But but no public transportation except for those aging streetcars and a few buses. And we constantly were taking the wheelchair out of the car, putting it in the car. The streets in New Orleans, of course, have tree roots that have broken up the sidewalks, and
Yeah,
there's no way of taking a walk with a wheelchair, not an option.
right, right.
Well,
Did you have any injuries as a result of having to schlep a wheelchair in and out of the back of a car? Back injuries, arm
No,
injuries?
no, I was cautious, and I had my daughter and my wonderful saintly son-in-law
Okay.
who endless patience.
So one of my last memories of leaving New Orleans was being nervous about the flight the night before, and I was down near the Jack's Brewery, the apartment where I was at, and I could hear gunfire at night,
Mm,
multiple shots, not just one
mhm.
or two, you know. And I remember thinking I wouldn't be that comfortable walking the streets at night, right then in that part of town. But I was flying to Israel, and
Mm.
I thought, well, how different is it going to be in Israel? And the answer was vastly different at that point in time, 1999. Even though there was a war in Lebanon, I don't remember
Right.
hearing any gunshots. I only heard sonic booms from the jets flying into Lebanon from Israel.
Wow. I have an interesting story about that too. I go to a support group for people, spouses of people with dementia, and it's out of, no, it's not out of New Orleans. It's with the Alzheimer's Association. And this particular group happens to be out of Ohio. And one of the topics that's been raised by some of the wives is what should I do with the guns that we own? I don't want my husband to have access to it, and he wants to be able to caress it or whatever. He wants to be able to have access to his gun. And I just thought, thank God I don't have that problem.
Yeah,
Not for myself. People just don't own guns here. I don't have it for myself. I don't have it for my neighbors.
yeah, that's a health issue that I would love to cover at some point. Um, Austria is without a doubt a the Austrian culture is without a doubt a gun culture. but the laws are sensible. And so one of the biggest companies in this country is Glock. 25% of American police officers carry Austrian Glocks manufactured in the US, but they're still Glocks. But we don't have anything like the gun crime that you see in the US. And it's simply it's been legislated in such a way that it's not a big problem.
Right.
It's really like a non-issue. Like that's one thing, just when you're in the public transportation, knowing that the person sitting next to you doesn't have a gun. It just, in the 16 years I've lived here, I don't even think I've ever seen one except at a museum.
I saw a guy on the subway with a handgun a couple months ago. Pretty big, scary looking guy too, and he had a concealed handgun on him. But he wasn't trying to hide it. I mean, when I say concealed, it was, it was holstered on his hip with a jacket over it, and I can only assume that he's a security officer of some kind, or he's a police officer of some kind. In general, you're not allowed to carry a gun on the subway. You can carry a longbow on the subway, because I've seen that.
Yeah.
But you can't carry a gun unless you're specifically licensed to do that.
Diane, I had two questions regarding the healthcare that you had mentioned. So when you guys first arrived, and then Craig had the stroke, and you had to pay the 11,000 cash, then you got into the French system. So were there any issues, him having a pre-existing condition?
No. Oh, no. No, not at all.
That wasn't a question on one of the many forms that you had to fill out.
No, not at all.
And what can I ask? What is the monthly cost for you paying into the system?
Well, taxes are higher here. I can't tell you what the line item for Social Security or healthcare is. Taxes, I don't know, they run about between 35 and 40%, but I'm not making as much as I was making in the US. So yeah, I don't feel it really. And the beautiful thing is I'm getting most of my career was in the US, so I'm getting Social Security from the US and bringing the money over here. So I'm getting paid at a US rate and living at a country that has a much lower cost of living.
Mm-hmm. But then you pay taxes on your Social Security to France.
Yes. Well, I have to roll. Actually, I was doing my taxes just before we started this conversation. So up on that, you roll in your Social Security pension, and whatever you made in France, it becomes one sum, but you only pay in one country or the other. So there's a treaty between France and the US that says you will pay either in one country or the other. And I pay it in France because my income is lower in France. And I just don't feel it at all.
And then I had a question, because you guys went back to the States last year for 3 months, and considering, your husband's health condition, I mean, did you then take out an additional health care plan while you were there? Did you guys utilize the French plan that you had? How did you navigate that trip?
Well, we were both eligible for Medicare, and we'd been paying for it all along while we were here, just in case we ever wanted to go back, since we do have a child there. And my husband doesn't speak French, so I thought he might be more comfortable there. So we were paying for Medicare. So that covers, I didn't realize that only covers 80% of the cost. And most people in my age group have supplemental plan for the other 20%. So for that 20%, we had to pay $500 a month just for my husband, okay? To cover the 20% that Medicare would not cover. That was not drugs. There was a separate plan that we had to purchase as well for like $200 or $300 a month that covered the drugs. So we had like an $800 a month outlay of insurance in addition to what we were already paying for Medicare.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then you had mentioned earlier on the call that you're still getting invoices. So did that cover then all of the costs while you were there, or were there some secret?
No, there were still some things I had to pay for. Yeah, we had to pay for.
Some medical expenses during that time?
Yeah.
You said the gift that keeps on giving. Oh, so
Yeah.
I bet you're happy to be back in France.
I'm very happy to be here in France. In our case, like I said, I had hoped that my husband might be more comfortable in an English environment, and I had the thought of putting him into a nursing care home with a memory unit. He did not take to it at all. He just did not want to be in a communal environment, an institutional environment. So I learned very early on that it wasn't the language that was the barrier. He just didn't want to be in that environment. And he was not going to acclimate to it. But interestingly enough, he became agitated and a bit violent. And so the protocol in America, if that happens, when he was in a trial situation at a nursing home. The protocol is they ship you to the emergency room and then they ship you out to a psychiatric hospital. So my husband spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric hospital not in New Orleans. It was way out in the boonies, in the marshes of Louisiana. And we had to schlep over there a couple hours each direction for 3 weeks. But what's interesting is that the purpose of that stay was to get him a cocktail of various drugs that would calm him down. And they also gave him something that they hoped might improve his memory. But it's exactly the same drugs as they provide here for people with his condition. Because when I came back, I checked in advance with our doctors here and they said, oh, yeah, we can get you all those drugs. And they just only change was now we don't pay for it. There's no copay at all. And over time, these drugs tend to lose their effectiveness. So he's going in again for the same kind of protocol here in France. He's going to spend 3 weeks in a psychiatric hospital. They're going to work on his cocktail of drugs and they'll tweak it. So that's what I was saying before, is that the protocols are very similar between the US and Europe.
What do you think has been the health impact of this, reduced cost and reduced burden, having your husband with these health conditions in France versus in the US? What has been the change in your health as a result of being back in France?
Voila. He doesn't sense that much difference because of his dementia. But for me, it is such a relief. It's just a whole layer that I don't have to worry about. I had all the worry and it's a terribly emotional roller coaster that you have to be on when your spouse of 38 years is suddenly disappearing before your eyes. But at least I don't have to worry about financial ruin and all of the decisions that you have to make. And I find when I speak to my friends of my age over in the States, 80% of the conversation is about what healthcare coverage do you have, and what's your, it's all about that, and the acronyms and it's head spinning. So I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. And that's something that's hard to put a price on. When you're doing the math, that's never going to be a line item in the spreadsheet.
Right.
But it should be.
Absolutely. Yeah? It should be.
Well, that's all I've got.
And for people who don't have as drastic situations as my husband does, it is so easy and accessible to get in the healthcare system if you're working. It just happens automatically, and they have online systems where information is shared across all the specialists on your case. It's really every bit as up to date as the American systems. The only difference being that when you come into the doctor's office, the first question they ask you is not, what insurance do you have? They ask you, what's the problem? What can we
Yeah.
do for you? How can we help you? And that is just such a different icebreaker.
And I'm assuming you have a medical card, a social
Yes,
insurance card. It's got your data
yes,
on it. And so they don't even need to ask you for that information. They simply put the card in the machine. They see who you are and your
exactly.
history. Yeah.
Yeah, it's called a carte vitale, and it's used at the doctor's office. Puts it in, doctor puts it in, sees all my information. Also at the pharmacist,
Yeah.
pharmacist flips it in. They can tell you, oh, you ordered this last week. We can't give you another order of that until whatever. So everything is carefully controlled and monitored, and it's a single payer. So
Yeah.
you don't have to
Same in
compile the
Austria.
information across all of the different hands.
And fill out this forms with the same information everywhere you go. Yeah.
Right.
There's no reason to not have that in the US.
Yeah.
This kind of a
Well,
card
yeah.
is it streamlines processes across so many different organizations. It's got to be a huge savings, right?
Right.
Just from the reduction in labor and errors and lawsuits as a result of the errors, you know?
Well, what I'm most conscious, I'm sure there are many, many reasons that healthcare is so expensive in the US, but what seems to be, to me, the common theme is that every profession is an interest group and every profession
Yeah,
lobbies for their comfort. And there is no will to, to reduce the fees of doctors and reduce the fees of drugs. Um, yeah, so just like I was wondering when I was in the US as well, was the reason that they were more willing to do tests, just gratuitous tests that MRIs on my husband's brain, for example, that weren't going to produce great breakthroughs in treatment for him. Was that because of the customer service ethic that they wanted me to feel comfortable that they'd done everything humanly possible? Or was it because they had this great machine which they had to amortize the use of? Or was it because somebody else was going to make more money if within the US, I find I'm always following the money. Where is whose palm is getting greased? And of course, you see it on TV too. I mean, every other commercial is for a drug, which I don't understand how that works either. Ask your doctor about so and so. Why should you be asking your doctor? Why doesn't your doctor tell you what you're supposed to be taking?
Which
Um,
is interesting, yes, because this is not a trend in Europe that they have commercials for
no, not at
pharmaceuticals.
all. And you don't have to ask yourself, what's this person's motive? Why are they pushing this drug on me? The benefit, or there's a sort of understanding that it's for the public good.
Which I think is also difficult for Americans to kind of grasp this concept because you go up in a society, of capitalism, and it's all about making the money, and then to have, the state that's kind of taking care of you. It's just a completely different process altogether, and it's not this scary socialist red monster.
Exactly. I came here thinking I was a Francophile. I love French literature, French film. I love the French language, and I didn't know I was going to love socialism. That sort of came as a byproduct. I didn't realize that France was a socialist country. I just thought of it as the country of Louis the 14th. Who knew that since World War II, it's a socialist country?
yeah, that's one of the impacts of the war, I
Yeah,
think, because
absolutely.
during that war, everyone was in the same boat,
Hmm.
essentially suffering through the same predicament. And so to rebuild, one of the things that got rebuilt was a social safety net that included everyone.
Exactly. And Americans don't like to use the language, but America was a socialist country for a brief period at that time as well. That's the
Yeah,
period
after
where,
the Depression. Yeah.
yeah, gave us Medicare and unemployment insurance and all that good stuff.
And on that note, I think it's appropriate to mention that we're recording this on May 8th, and in France, the ending of the war is being celebrated today. So it's very convenient, Diane, that you're joining us today on
That's right.
May 8th. Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time. And oh, you and your husband, I just wish you guys just all the best of luck dealing with that. But thank goodness, you're in France getting the care that you need.
Exactly. I do thank my lucky stars every day.
Well, you've been
Such a
really
convenient
helpful.
place.
I appreciate very much your willingness to come and help us inform Americans that might want to live in France or Austria. Please share and like on YouTube once that comes out.
I will do that. Thank you. I think
All
it's
right,
a
thanks
great
a lot.
project that you've got going on.
Well, we've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Dear listeners, if you have any topics that you would like for us to cover, or even have an interesting story that you would like to share with our community, please send us an email at that's us@americansabroadcast.com. You can also find useful links and notes to this episode at blog.americansabroadcast.com. So that's all for today, and we hope you'll join us next time as we continue to cover studying abroad in grad school with a university admin expert from Switzerland. Thank you all for listening to Americans Abroadcast, and until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep exploring.